There was a time in America when owning a home didn't mean luxury. It didn't mean granite countertops, open concept kitchens, or designer lighting. It meant something quieter, something humbler. It meant dignity. A small house, a narrow driveway, 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a modest front lawn that had to be watered by hand. These homes weren't built to impress. They were built to hold a life. For generations, this was the unspoken agreement. If you worked hard, stayed disciplined, and played by the rules, this place, simple as it was, would eventually be yours. Not a dream home, a starter home. And for decades, these houses quietly shaped the American middle class. They stood in rows on calm streets. They filled new suburbs. They welcomed factory workers, teachers, mechanics, clerks, veterans returning from war. Inside them, families grew slowly. Furniture was bought over time. Walls collected memories instead of decorations. These houses didn't promise wealth. They promised stability. And that promise mattered more than people realize today. Because a starter home wasn't just a structure. It was a psychological anchor, a signal that life had begun and was finally predictable. You could plan inside those walls. You could breathe. You could imagine a future that didn't feel fragile. But today, those homes are disappearing, not through demolition, not through fire or disaster, not through a single moment anyone remembers. They vanished quietly, absorbed into speculation, redesigned for profit, inflated beyond recognition, priced far beyond the reach of the very people they were built for. What replaced them wasn't just more expensive housing. It was an entirely different philosophy. Homes stopped being beginnings. They became assets, instruments, vehicles for leverage, yield, and extraction. And somewhere along the way, something subtle but devastating happened. The ladder was pulled up. Young families were told to wait longer, to rent indefinitely, to save more while prices rose faster than wages ever could. And slowly, almost invisibly, the doorway into adulthood narrowed. This is not just a story about housing. It's a story about who America became and who it quietly left behind. Because when starter homes disappeared, so did something deeper. The belief that effort naturally led to stability. The sense that progress followed a clear path. The feeling that the system had room for you. This is the tragic story of America's starter homes. The houses that once defined the middle class, and how their disappearance reshaped an entire nation. In the years following World War II, the United States entered a period unlike anything it had experienced before. Factories that once produced weapons shifted to refrigerators, washing machines, and automobiles. Soldiers returned home not just as survivors, but as participants in a national rebuilding project. There was a shared understanding, rarely spoken, widely felt, that stability was no longer a privilege but a goal within reach. America needed homes, not palaces, not estates, homes. What emerged was a quiet architectural revolution, the starter home. These houses were deliberately modest. They were small by design, efficient by necessity, and repetitive by intention. Entire neighborhoods were built at once, using similar floor plans, similar materials, and similar expectations about who would live inside them. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a living room that doubled as a dining area, a kitchen built for function, not display. They were not unique, and that was the point. Starter homes were built for firsts, first jobs, first marriages, first children, first sense of permanence. They represented an entry point, a beginning rather than an end. And for a generation shaped by war and scarcity, that beginning was enough. Programs like the GI Bill made homeownership possible for millions of returning veterans. Low-interest loans, long repayment periods, and government-backed guarantees lowered the barrier to entry. A man could work a steady job, support a family, and afford a home without extraordinary income. For many, it was the first time ownership felt attainable. These houses filled the growing suburbs surrounding American cities. They lined newly paved streets, often without trees at first, waiting years for shade to arrive. Children rode bicycles between identical lawns. Neighbors knew one another by name, not because they were forced to, but because lives unfolded slowly enough to allow familiarity. Inside these homes, life followed a predictable rhythm. Furniture was purchased gradually. Walls were painted by hand. Repairs were done on weekends. There was no pressure to upgrade immediately. No sense that the house was incomplete. It was understood that this was a place to grow into, not grow out of. And that understanding mattered. Because a starter home didn't just shelter a family. It structured their expectations. It taught patience. It taught delayed gratification. It taught that progress was incremental. You didn't need to leap ahead. You only needed to stay on the path. For decades, this system worked because it aligned architecture, economics, and psychology. Homes were priced relative to wages. Jobs were stable enough to plan around. And time itself felt cooperative. People assumed the future would resemble the present, only slightly better. The middle class was not defined by luxury but by predictability. Knowing what tomorrow would look like was the real privilege. But this balance was fragile. Starter homes existed within a narrow historical window, one supported by post-war expansion, favorable policies, and a shared belief in long-term stability. They required restraint, from builders, from buyers, and from the system itself. And restraint rarely survives prosperity. As decades passed, tastes began to change. Houses slowly grew larger. Kitchens expanded. Garages multiplied. The language around housing shifted, subtly at first, from living to investing. But in the early years, few noticed. Because for those who lived inside starter homes, life felt complete. They weren't chasing returns. They weren't optimizing square footage. They weren't comparing finishes. They were raising families, building routines, putting down roots. And for a time, America believed that this was the natural order of things, that modest beginnings led eventually to security. That effort led to ownership. That ownership led to stability. The starter home wasn't glamorous, but it was honest. And in its quiet way, it held together the promise of the American middle class. What no one realized then was how easily that promise could unravel. To understand why starter homes mattered so deeply, it's not enough to look at blueprints or price tags. You have to understand what they did to the human mind. For much of the 20th century, housing in America wasn't primarily a financial decision. It was a life decision. A starter home wasn't chosen because it promised appreciation. It was chosen because it promised relief. Relief from uncertainty. Relief from transience. Relief from feeling temporary in your own life. For the middle class, that relief was transformative. Owning a modest home created a psychological shift that renting never could. Rent was something you paid to survive the present. A mortgage, even a small one, was something you paid to secure the future. Each monthly payment felt like movement. Slow, deliberate progress toward something permanent. That sense of progress mattered. Because once people felt anchored, they behaved differently. They planned longer. They saved more patiently. They took responsibility not just for their homes, but for their neighborhoods. Starter homes created continuity. People stayed. Children grew up on the same streets. Schools stabilized. Communities formed not through intention, but through time. And time back then felt generous. There was also something quietly equalizing about these houses. They didn't sharply distinguish the successful from the struggling. Most homes looked similar. Most families lived within comparable means. Status differences existed, but they weren't carved into architecture. You couldn't instantly tell who earned more simply by driving down the street. That mattered more than people realized. It reduced social anxiety. It lowered comparison. It softened ambition just enough to keep it human. The middle class didn't define itself by excess, but by sufficiency. Enough space, enough privacy, enough hope. Starter homes also played a critical role in family formation. They arrived at exactly the moment many Americans were ready to settle into adulthood. Marriage, children, and long-term work were not delayed indefinitely. Life followed a sequence that felt natural and attainable. The house was the hinge point. It signaled that it was time to build, not just materially but emotionally. Inside those walls, people made long-term commitments to spouses, to children, to routines that repeated year after year. The home absorbed stress, conflict, joy, and loss, and remained standing. That stability had downstream effects. Children raised in stable homes performed better in school. Communities with long-term residents experienced lower crime. Local institutions, churches, schools, small businesses, depended on people who stayed put. In this way, starter homes quietly became infrastructure. Not physical infrastructure, but social infrastructure. They held society together without announcing it. But this balance relied on one fragile assumption, that housing would remain primarily a place to live. And slowly, that assumption began to erode. As decades passed, the language around housing changed. Homes were no longer discussed mainly in terms of comfort or suitability. They were discussed in terms of potential, appreciation, resale value, return on investment. This shift didn't happen overnight. It crept in gradually, often framed as wisdom. People were told their home should work for them, that they should build equity. That square footage was leverage, that upgrading was progress. At first it sounded reasonable, but something subtle was lost. The home began to carry expectations it was never meant to bear. Instead of being a foundation for life, it became a measure of success. Instead of offering psychological safety, it began to demand performance. And starter homes, humble, restrained, finite, no longer fit this new logic. They didn't optimize returns. They didn't impress. They didn't scale. They were built for sufficiency in a culture that was learning to worship excess. As housing values rose, the idea of remaining in a modest home started to feel like stagnation rather than stability. Families were encouraged to trade up, expand, consume more space than they needed. And with that encouragement came a quiet recalibration of worth. Where once dignity came from ownership itself, it now came from comparison. Bigger homes implied success. Smaller homes implied falling behind. Starter homes, once symbols of beginning, began to look like symbols of limitation. Still, many remained, holding their value not in dollars but in lives lived fully inside them. What few realized was that the forces reshaping housing were not neutral. They were directional, and they were slowly closing the door behind the generation that had already passed through. The house that built the middle class was still standing, but the system that allowed it to function was beginning to change. The transformation did not begin with a single law, a single crisis, or a single generation. It began with a shift in mindset. At some point in the late 20th century, Americans started to speak about homes differently. The language softened at first, disguised as prudence and intelligence. Buying a home was no longer just about living. It was about making a smart move. A house, people were told, was not merely shelter. It was leverage. It was equity. It was a vehicle for wealth. On the surface, this idea seemed harmless, even empowering. After all, who wouldn't want their home to gain value? Who wouldn't want security to compound over time? But this new way of thinking carried consequences that were not immediately visible. Because once homes became assets, they entered a different moral universe. Assets are meant to grow. Assets are meant to outperform. Assets are meant to be optimized, and optimization is rarely gentle. As housing prices rose, ownership began to feel less like a destination and more like a strategy. People paid closer attention to square footage, resale value, and neighborhood rankings. Decisions that were once emotional became analytical. A home was no longer chosen primarily for how it felt, but for how it would perform. Starter homes struggled to survive in this environment. They were too small to maximize profit, too modest to excite buyers chasing appreciation, too restrained to compete in a market driven by expansion. Builders noticed this first. Constructing smaller homes often required the same regulatory effort as building larger ones, while generating less revenue. Zoning laws, minimum lot sizes, and parking requirements quietly discouraged modest construction. So developers adjusted. Homes grew larger, garages multiplied, kitchens expanded into living spaces. Square footage became a selling point rather than a necessity. At the same time, land values increased, especially near growing cities. To justify the cost of land, builders needed higher sale prices. Starter homes, by definition, did not support those margins, and so they slowly disappeared from new construction. What replaced them were homes designed not for entry but for escalation. This change reshaped expectations. Young buyers were no longer stepping into ownership gradually. They were being asked to leap, to buy more house than they needed, or remain renters indefinitely. The gap between renting and owning widened, and for those already inside the system, rising prices felt like success. Their homes appreciated. Their net worth grew on paper. They felt validated. Few questioned what that appreciation depended on, because rising home values require exclusion. For prices to keep climbing, fewer people must be able to buy. This truth was rarely acknowledged openly. It was treated as an unfortunate side effect rather than a structural necessity. As homes became financial instruments, a new class of buyer emerged: investors. At first they were small. Individuals purchasing second homes, local landlords acquiring a few properties. But over time, institutional capital entered the market. Homes were bundled, analyzed, purchased in bulk. What once housed families now housed balance sheets. Starter homes, with their predictable layouts and stable neighborhoods, became especially attractive targets. They were easy to rent, easy to manage, and located where demand was consistent. Entire neighborhoods quietly shifted from ownership to tenancy. The house still looked the same from the outside. The lawn was still trimmed. The structure still stood. But something essential had changed. The people inside were no longer building equity. They were no longer anchored long-term. They were no longer shaping the future of the neighborhood. They were temporary again. And temporariness changes behavior. When people don't expect to stay, they invest less emotionally. They plan shorter. They hesitate to commit. The psychological anchor that once defined middle-class life loosened. Meanwhile, younger generations found themselves trapped between rising prices and stagnant wages. The old equation, work steadily, save modestly, buy a starter home, no longer balanced, not because people stopped working hard, but because the system they inherited had shifted beneath their feet. Homes had become assets first, and homes second, and assets are indifferent to the human consequences of their performance. By the time this transformation became obvious, it was already complete. Starter homes had not vanished in a dramatic collapse. They had been absorbed into a new logic, a logic where value was measured in returns, where space was monetized, where beginnings were no longer profitable. What was lost was not just affordability, it was accessibility, predictability, and the sense that life followed a sequence ordinary people could still enter. The tragedy was not that homes became expensive. The tragedy was that they stopped being beginnings, and once that door closed, reopening it would prove far more difficult than anyone imagined. There was no single moment when Americans woke up and realized starter homes were gone. No headline announced it, no protest formed around it, no law explicitly outlawed modest housing. The disappearance happened quietly, spread across years, regulations, incentives, and market signals that felt reasonable in isolation. That was what made it so effective. Cities grew, populations shifted, demand increased, and with growth came a new vocabulary: efficiency, density, optimization, yield. Each term sounded sensible, necessary even, but together, they reshaped the housing landscape in ways few fully understood at the time. Zoning laws played a central role. Many cities enforced minimum lot sizes, minimum square footage requirements, and parking mandates that made small homes increasingly impractical to build. What once could be placed modestly on a narrow parcel now required more land, more infrastructure, and more capital. Starter homes, which thrived on simplicity, struggled to survive these constraints. Developers followed incentives. They always have. If regulations made small homes financially unviable, builders responded by constructing larger ones. If land prices rose, they increased square footage to justify the cost. If profit margins favored luxury, modesty quietly lost. None of this required conspiracy, only alignment. At the same time, existing starter homes began to change hands. Older owners sold as families downsized or passed on. Younger buyers, once the natural successors, were increasingly priced out. Investors stepped in, often offering cash, speed, and certainty. The transaction made sense to sellers. It also changed the neighborhood forever. Once a home transitioned from ownership to rental, it rarely returned. What had been a rung on the ladder became a permanent holding, one less entry point for the next generation. Multiply that by thousands of homes across countless cities, and the effect compounded. Yet from the street, nothing looked wrong. The houses still stood, the mail still arrived, the lawns were still mowed. The loss was invisible because it was structural, not physical. Another factor accelerated the shift: cultural aspiration. As housing was reframed as an investment, expectations inflated. Buyers were encouraged to stretch budgets, maximize borrowing power, and think of their first home as a statement rather than a step. Starter homes were reframed as compromises, temporary solutions, something to endure rather than appreciate. People were told to wait until they could afford something better. But waiting became indefinite. Wages did not rise at the same pace as housing costs. Student debt delayed savings. Job markets became less stable. The predictable life sequence that once led naturally to ownership fractured. And still, no alarm sounded, because each individual struggle felt personal rather than systemic. People blamed themselves. They assumed they were late. They believed they hadn't done enough yet. The system rarely admits its own limits. Meanwhile, financial institutions refined their models. Real estate became increasingly abstract, measured in yield curves and risk profiles rather than households. Starter homes, with their lower ceilings on profit, simply didn't compete. They weren't destroyed. They weren't outlawed. They were just outbid. This process created a strange paradox. America was still building houses, still expanding suburbs, still growing wealth. But it was no longer building beginnings. The housing ladder didn't break at the top. It broke at the bottom. And ladders missing their first rungs don't look broken to those already climbing. They only fail those still standing on the ground. By the time the disappearance became obvious, it was framed as inevitability. This is just how markets work. This is just supply and demand. This is just the cost of growth. But inevitability is often just the absence of resistance. What made the disappearance of starter homes especially tragic was not that it happened, but that it happened without acknowledgement. No moment of reflection, no pause to ask what was being lost, no collective decision to preserve the entry point into stability. The door didn't slam shut. It closed softly. And for those who arrived just a little too late, the silence was deafening. For the generations that came after, the disappearance of starter homes did not arrive as a policy debate or an economic shift. It arrived as confusion. Young adults followed the same script their parents had been given. They went to school, they worked, they saved when they could, and they waited for the moment when ownership would make sense. But the moment never came. The numbers refused to align. Prices rose faster than wages. Down payments expanded beyond reach. Rents absorbed what little surplus remained. What once felt like a temporary stage of life became a prolonged condition. Renting stopped being a bridge. It became a holding pattern. Without the anchor of ownership, life felt less settled. Decisions were delayed. Families formed later, if at all. Moves became frequent. Roots grew shallow. This wasn't because people lacked ambition. It was because the path that once rewarded effort had narrowed. The absence of starter homes didn't just affect housing, it reshaped adulthood. Marriage, once aligned with home ownership, drifted later. Children, once raised in predictable neighborhoods, became riskier commitments. Long-term planning felt fragile in a world where permanence was no longer guaranteed. Stability had become conditional, and conditional stability changes how people live. They hedge, they postpone, they remain cautious even when they want to commit. The psychological weight of this uncertainty was subtle but persistent. Owning a home once marked a transition, from trying to belonging, from temporary to rooted, from youth to adulthood. Without that transition, many felt suspended between stages, working, but not settled, earning, but not building, living, but not anchoring. Meanwhile, those who already owned homes saw their wealth increase, often without intention or effort. Equity accumulated quietly. The gap widened. This divide wasn't framed as conflict, it was framed as timing. You should have bought earlier. We didn't know prices would rise like this. That's just how it is now. But timing is not neutral. Timing decides who enters and who is excluded. And exclusion compounds. Those without ownership found it harder to save. Those without savings found it harder to buy. Each year of delay pushed the goal further away. Starter homes had once absorbed this tension. They provided a manageable first step, a way to participate without overextending. Without them, the leap became too large. Some adapted. They moved farther from cities. They downsized expectations. They accepted longer commutes. Others opted out entirely. They rented indefinitely. They shared housing longer. They abandoned the idea of ownership altogether. What emerged was not just a housing crisis, but a shift in identity. The middle class had long been defined by ownership, by the sense that life moved forward through accumulation and permanence. Without that pathway, the identity blurred. People still worked, still contributed, still hoped. But hope felt provisional, and provisional hope is exhausting. The older generation often struggled to understand this change. From their perspective, the system that worked for them was still visible. The houses still stood, the neighborhood still existed. What had changed was access. The door was there, but locked. This gap in experience created quiet resentment, often unspoken. Not anger directed outward, but frustration turned inward. A sense of falling behind despite doing everything right. The tragedy was not just economic. It was existential. A society that removes its entry points doesn't just limit opportunity, it alters the rhythm of life. When beginnings disappear, people stop trusting that effort leads somewhere. And when trust erodes, so does cohesion. The new America wasn't defined by poverty or collapse, it was defined by delay. Delayed ownership, delayed stability, delayed belonging. All because the first step, once small, modest, and attainable, had quietly vanished. When people speak about the loss of starter homes, the conversation often collapses into numbers. Prices, interest rates, inventory, supply and demand. But what was lost cannot be measured that way. Because the true loss was not square footage, it was sequence. For most of the 20th century, life in America followed a rhythm that felt coherent. Education led to work. Work led to ownership. Ownership led to stability. Stability made room for family, community, and long-term thinking. Starter homes were the hinge that made that rhythm possible. They were not endpoints, they were transitions. They allowed ordinary people to step into adulthood without being crushed by it, to make mistakes in manageable spaces, to grow slowly, without the pressure to perform. When that transition disappeared, the rhythm broke. Life stopped unfolding and began stalling. People still moved forward, but without markers, without moments that said, "You are here now." The disappearance of starter homes removed a shared experience that once unified generations. Parents understood their children's lives because they had lived something similar. Neighbors shared expectations because they were building toward comparable goals. Today, that continuity is fractured. Older generations often remember ownership as responsibility. Younger generations experience housing as risk. One generation built equity by staying. The next learned to stay flexible by leaving. Neither choice was moral. Both were adaptive. But adaptation comes at a cost. Without beginnings, society becomes top-heavy. Wealth concentrates. Mobility slows. Trust erodes, not loudly, but steadily. And trust is the invisible infrastructure that holds nations together. When people believe effort will be rewarded, they participate. They invest. They commit. When that belief weakens, they withdraw. They delay. They hedge. The loss of starter homes did not create despair. It created hesitation. And hesitation reshapes culture more quietly than despair ever could. The tragedy is not that America changed. Change is inevitable. The tragedy is that change happened without intention, without asking what should be preserved alongside progress. Starter homes were never glamorous. They didn't photograph well. They didn't symbolize aspiration in advertisements. But they performed a function that no luxury development ever could. They made the future feel reachable. And once that feeling disappears, no amount of growth can replace it. Today, the houses still exist. They stand on familiar streets. They cast the same shadows in the afternoon sun. They look much as they always did. But they no longer serve the role they once played. They are investments now, assets, holdings, and something sacred was lost in that translation. Not nostalgia, but orientation. A society without clear beginnings struggles to imagine clear endings. It becomes restless, anxious, and uncertain of itself. Because beginnings teach patience. They teach humility. They teach that life is built, not won. The starter home taught those lessons quietly every day without demanding attention. Its disappearance left no ruins, no empty lots, no visible scars. Only a subtle absence, felt most by those who arrive and find no door waiting. This is not a call to return to the past. It is a recognition of what once worked, and why it mattered. Because sometimes, what holds a nation together isn't innovation or growth. It's the simple promise that there is still a place to begin.